I don't know how particular you are about the way people pronounce your name. Um, my last name has been mispronounced so many times over the years. Beatty, Batty, Beauty. That was my favorite. I was introduced as Pastor Beauty one time. I like that. It didn't stick. Didn't even get it on a T-shirt, none of that. I think names are interesting things, aren't they? If you go back far enough in history, names were huge, and they meant a big deal. And maybe you know what your name means. That's always something that's been interesting to find out, is what somebody's name means. Maybe somebody gave you a plaque or a T-shirt, or they put it on a mug, and maybe when you named your kids, you knew what their names meant. Just in case you're curious, David means beloved or loved by God. So you can put whatever else you want to put with that, but that's what my name means. But in the old days, names really did mean something. It wasn't just a label by which you called somebody across a parking lot. And so I would raise the question this morning, maybe our names still mean something. Maybe they still affect things whenever our names are said. But here's what I do know. When somebody mentions your name, it takes the conversation to a whole nother level. Hopefully it's not as an insult. You dirty rat. No, nothing like that. But when you hear your name, there's just something about it. Even in a big room, if somebody says your name, you most likely heard it and turned. Research shows that if you hook up your brain to a brain scan or an MRI as we know it, and they give you a list, to start reading a list of names and things and so forth, nothing really gets interesting on the MRI until you hear your name. When you hear your name, there's really strategic parts of your brain that just fire up. There are areas of your brain that are activated simply because you heard your name. So whatever your name means, I promise you, when it gets said, it gets your attention, doesn't it? But we're moving through this series of 10 interactions between God and people, and they're all taking place on mountains. And today we're going to look at a guy who was moving up the corporate ladder. Things were going very well for him. He had amazing connections. He caught a lot of breaks, okay? He's on his way up when suddenly he gets knocked off the ladder. He loses his security, his wealth, his connections, and his future. And I think at that point he's probably starting to believe that he's finished. There's not much that's going to happen to him good after this. But just at the time that he thinks he's been put on the shelf, the time that he thinks maybe God is finished with him completely, something unexpected happens. God calls him by name. And it changes everything. It changes the course of history. Even for you and me, it changes. He's the central character of Hebrew Scripture. He's possibly the most human of heroes that we ever get to look at. He's a real interesting character. So we're going to be spending 2 weeks on this same person. But I think we'll go ahead and put his name up there. His name is Moses. Moses. And I want to do my best to kind of put him in context for us. I want to go kind of from where we were last week in Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, to Exodus, the second book of the Bible. So if you remember, just a little bit of reminder from last week. We were dealing with Abraham and everything that happened between Abraham and his son Isaac, okay? So historically, we move on. Abraham dies. Isaac carries on the family tradition. He carries on the faith of his father. Isaac has 2 sons. They're twins, and they are a handful. And we're just going to talk about one of them this morning. We don't have time to go any deeper than that. But this boy's name is Jacob. Now Jacob, fast forward a little bit, in his old age, gets renamed by God. That'd be interesting, wouldn't it, to get your name changed when you are advanced in years and now you're supposed to go by something else. God calls him Israel, which means God will prevail. Why is that important? Because names were important in the world at that time. This Jacob has 12 sons. From these 12 sons come the 12 tribes of Israel. One of these boys, his name is Joseph, and he is his father's favorite. I know none of you have favorites of your kids or anything like that. You know better, right? Yeah, well, trust me, it caused a lot of trouble because Dad really loves Joseph. Joseph used to tend sheep with his brothers in Canaan. He sometimes would tattle on his brothers, but he is mostly known for what? His amazing Technicolor dream coat. You got to get the name right, you know? Yeah, and was it Donny Osmond? Is he the one who played that in the theater? Yeah, something like that. So it really wears thin with his brothers. So they decide they're going to sell him into slavery. And he is sold into a group of Ishmaelites, which we learned last week that was Jacob's brother. And Jacob and Esau, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little behind myself here. But what happens to Joseph when he gets to Egypt is he is given responsibility, and then he's falsely accused, then he's arrested, then he's imprisoned, and it looks like he's forgotten. And just when you think his story is over, with God's leading, he rises through the ranks very quickly and becomes the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. The whole family then moves down. Exodus chapter 1. When you turn that page and you get to the first page of Exodus, what you find is that this immigrant clan has now grown to such a size that they are basically a nation within a nation. We're probably historically around the mid-1400s BC. Okay? There's been a change of power in Egypt. The Pharaoh that was there when Joseph was alive is no longer there. We're talking hundreds of years after Joseph's time. And things are really not looking good. And that may explain Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. It's kind of an ominous verse. Look what it says. It says, "Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt." So it's kind of like there's a new sheriff in town who really doesn't care at all for that old story of Joseph. This Pharaoh is threatened by this growing nation within a nation. He's threatened by all these immigrants. He really doesn't know what to do with them. He's afraid that they're going to try to take over. They're getting that big. So now the story takes a very dark turn. At first, his tactic is to enslave the Hebrew nation. But even that doesn't stop their growth. They just keep having babies and keep having babies and keep having babies. And the harder he works to get rid of the Hebrew people, the more fruitful they become. I kind of see the hand of God involved in that, don't you? When things are all so bad, and yet God is blessing them tremendously. So, unfortunately, this new sheriff in town takes another step, and I don't know how else to say it, but we would have to call it genocide. He orders the death of every infant male born to the Hebrew people. Now, this plan gets messed up along the way in big ways and small. But this is the story into which Moses is born. Some people have likened this, they said this is really the first Holocaust because it's the first time that you see a crazed leader trying to eliminate the Jewish people. But because of the courage and the creativity of women, shout out to the women, didn't we just have Girls' Day or Women's Day earlier this week? Because of the creativity of women with names like Shiphrah and Puah and Miriam. Interesting names, right? Yeah. They're in your Bible, okay? By the way, the Bible's not boring. You are. Just want to remind you that because the Bible's fantastic. Women like these stand up to Pharaoh. They're very creative in getting around some of this. A couple of them were midwives, and they figured out how to see that these babies were actually born because Pharaoh wanted these babies put to death. But through all of their creativity, Moses is born and is protected. He even ends up living in the palace with Pharaoh's daughter. So this is what I want you to think about Moses growing up. He's connected. He's got education. He's probably got fame, wealth, and a future. He is on the fast track. But even though he's living like royalty, he begins to see things that bother him because, as we find out, Moses has a very deep sense of justice. The Bible tells us that he recognized the fact that he was one of these people, like the rest of the Jews, who was being oppressed and abused. Well, one day, and some of you remember these stories, one day Moses sees an Egyptian overlord physically abusing a Hebrew slave. And Moses loses it. He misuses his power and he kills the Egyptian. And he doesn't think anybody saw it. But unfortunately, it was seen. There is an eyewitness. Pharaoh finds out about it, learns the whole truth about Moses, and Moses is now wanted for murder. In an instant, he had to leave everything that was his in Egypt. He lost his connections, his friends, his resources, his bank account, his future, everything. He is forced into early retirement at the age of 40. And he doesn't know what he's going to do. Well, he has to escape Egypt to save his own life. And to do that, he goes to the land of Midian, which is where what we would look at, if you were looking at a map today, it would be northwest Saudi Arabia. That's where he went, was in that area. That's where we find Moses. He's safe. He bumps into a woman and comes to her rescue because he's got this huge sense of justice. So he rescues her. She is very excited about this, and she takes him back to meet the parents. And you can kind of figure out where this is going. He ends up marrying her, and when you piece all the details together, Moses spends the next 40 years tending sheep for his father-in-law. What a change. To go from being favored son of Pharaoh's daughter, not actual son, but she raised him like that, to now being a fugitive on the other side of the desert herding sheep. Exodus chapter 3 verse 1 says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian." Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but I'm guessing that he's probably eating Granny's victuals, and he's swimming in the cement pond with Ellie Mae. A reference to what TV show? The Beverly Hillbillies. Thank you so much. I was afraid you guys were all going to be those young ones, that never watched Jed Clampett and everybody else. But, think about it. Joseph would have been one of those kids in high school who would have been voted most likely to succeed, right? If the lady that's raising you is Pharaoh's daughter, you got a good chance there. Did I say Joseph again? Okay, you don't have to correct me, okay? I have a God-given correction source right over here. And I know there's somebody right next to you that would do it just the same. Thanks, Liz. It's what friends are for, right? Okay, so this guy ends up spending 40 years doing a job that most people would just not want to cross the street to do. Tending sheep in the desert. Is he safe? Yes. He is far, far away from the problems that were plaguing him in Egypt. He was away from all that. But he's also far, far away from the future that he thought he was going to have. I think he's grateful for the hospitality and generosity of his in-laws, but it's pretty easy to figure out as you read through the story that Moses is lonely. And he admits it. He has a son, and look what it says about what he gets named. This is Exodus chapter 2, verse 22. It says, Zipporah, that's his wife, gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. Gershom means stranger. It can mean lonely stranger. And Moses kind of explains it to us this way. He says, I named him that because I have become a stranger in a foreign land. In other words, I don't really belong here. I don't really fit in here. A casual observer might think that Moses has blown it and God is done with him, and that that's the end of the story, that he's finished. But let's push the pause button here for just a moment. Anybody here have any kind of idea as to what Moses is going through? Have you ever felt like you were a stranger in your own life? I think a lot of us have done that. You end up in a situation and you're going, this is not the way that I thought it was going to turn out. And because of that, I don't know what to do next. I had dreams, I had hopes, and they've all fallen apart. And it's really hard, isn't it, when somebody takes the dreams that you had and tells you that they're a waste, and they just throw them away. Maybe you've made a huge mistake. Maybe you're trying to clean up some of the ugliest messes you've ever been a part of, and you don't know what to do. Maybe it's not anything you chose. Maybe it's not anything you signed up for. But something came into your life, blew through everything you did, and these days, you're saying, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to turn next. Well, that's where Moses is. So in Exodus 3, which is where we're at, we find him on the far side of the desert. It was most likely rugged terrain, very rough area. I think it perfectly matched his mood. You know, the ground matched the way that he was feeling about himself. But when he least expects it, on a mountain called Horeb, God calls him by name. Let's look at Genesis chapter 3, verses 1. Exodus, excuse me. You guys would have caught that, right? No, you wouldn't have. Exodus chapter 3. I really goofed on that, didn't I? Oh, but you caught it. Liz types all of the slides up. So in case you ever see a mistake up there, it's my fault, okay? Because she catches the mistakes I make. Although this one she doesn't admit to. So, all right, Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Verse 2. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Now, I've made reference before, whenever I see that phrase, the angel of the Lord, I believe that is a reference to Jesus Christ. I think this is Jesus showing up in the Old Testament. My thoughts, not yours. Appeared to him in the flames of fire from within a bush. Verse 3. So Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. Verse 4, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. Now, a lot of us know this story. We've seen the movie, right? Oh, come on. Have a little fun with me. Well, what I want to do as we go through this is I want to ask you a series of questions, and they will be up on the screen as well, because this story needs to become real to us. There's a lesson that can be learned. There's actually several lessons, but this can apply to our lives. So let me ask you the first question. Why would God do it this way? Pardon? Okay, that's a very good answer. Is there other possibilities? I would say that's one right answer. Good job. Yeah. Why would God do it this way? I mean, it's a pretty unique way. If somebody were to speak to you out of a bush that's burning, but it's not burning up, wouldn't that get your attention? Yeah, freak you out, definitely. I think if you're God, though, you could do it however you wanted to. This is kind of what was going through my mind. Lightning bolts would be a nice touch, wouldn't it? You know, at the right time, to accentuate your words. Parting the sky, having an angelic choir show up. They're saving that one for when Jesus is born. I think an earthquake. They did that with Elijah. There are a lot of things that we could do. A lot of things that I could think of. But why would he try to get the attention of Moses with such a modest miracle as a bush on fire in the desert? Well, some people have suggested that it was a test for Moses. It was a test to see if Moses was really going to pay attention. Now, maybe that kind of a test needs to come to most of us. Moses had to pay attention to the extraordinary in the middle of his everyday life. I think God is saying, hey, if you'll pay attention to the little things, wait till you get a load of the big stuff that I can show you. But for Moses to notice this miracle, he has to slow down, doesn't he? It says here that what got his attention is not the fact that the bush was burning, but the fact that the bush was not burning up. My guess is, out in the desert like that, he had seen burning bushes before. Maybe lightning struck it, but this one was not burning up. So here's something else to kind of add to that particular question. How long does it take him to figure this out? How long does it take you to see something that God may put right in front of you? Think about that. We really don't know that much about what it was like. The terrain was rough and rugged. You could probably hear sheep in the background. Maybe the wind is whipping around the rocky outcroppings. I have no idea if, while this bush was burning, was it giving off the faint hint of a smell, wood burning, like that smell. I don't know. Could you hear it crackling? I don't know. When the wind blows, does it glow? You letting your imagination? Come on, that's why God gave it to you. Here's what I do know. The branches are not curling up. The leaves are not crinkling and blowing away. This whole thing, as it burns, is not caving in on itself in a mound of ash. How long does it take you to notice something like that? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 20 minutes? 30 minutes? The point here is that Moses was willing to slow down and notice something different. He was willing to stop his ordinary routine and pay attention. He was willing to notice that maybe God was up to something. Rabbi Kushner put it like this. He said the key is to pay attention to what is going on around you long enough to behold the miracle without falling asleep. He says there's another world right here within this one whenever we pay attention. So Moses basically says, I got to see this. I got to see this for myself. I'm going to pay attention to this. And that's when God calls him by name. Did you catch that at the end of verse 4? Moses. That would freak you out just a little bit, wouldn't it? You're out in the desert all day by yourself with your sheep, and all of a sudden there is a voice that's coming out of this bush that is not burning up. Incredible. Some people have called this the butane bush. I like that name. The butane bush. Okay. I'm the only one who thought that was cool. But what I love here is that Moses responds to this. Okay? This is not some cheesy Bible movie. I'm sorry. Bible movies, for the most part, have been low budget, poorly done. Not everything, okay, but poorly done. I would tell you there's no musical crescendo, right, building up in the background as this is all happening. And Moses does not go, behold, the bush burneth, but does not burneth up. Yea, verily, what does it speaketh to me? He doesn't do something like that. If you read the account, it's a beautiful human reaction. He hears his name, and his reaction, and it sounds really familiar to what we saw last week, his reaction is, here I am. Here I am. Now, he's not God. It's not that God doesn't know where he is, but God is trying to find out about his availability. And so Moses is kind of like, God, I can't explain this. I don't know what you're doing with this, but I'm here. So now what? This is one of the things that we need to talk about for just a second. Because some of us at this point are going, well, if I ever had a butane bush talk to me, I'm certain that I would respond to God. And that's what it would take, right? A bush on fire to get your attention. But can we just be honest? God doesn't speak to very many of us through flammable shrubbery. That's just not how he does these things. So what was it? Think about this. What was it that made that bush so special? If you keep reading here, what you find in verse 5, God says to him, do not come any closer. In other words, stop right there where you are. Don't take another step. He says, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Holy ground. The question is, what makes it holy? That's interesting, isn't it? Was it a ritual that was performed there? Was it an institution? Did somebody come by wearing ecclesiastical robes and say, oh, I declare this place to be holy? What is it that makes it holy? That's the question. What is it that makes this situation holy? I'll tell you what it is. It's God's presence. God's presence is at work there. That's what makes it holy. This place, very possibly, just the day before, was just a normal place where sheep and goats had been. But I need you to understand, this happened on a real mountain. These are real sheep. We don't know what it was really like to be there, but I can tell you what wasn't there. Italian marble, plush carpet, and gold-covered fixtures. Not there. Got it? What made this ground holy? God was there. If you keep reading in this book, it is amazing how ordinary the places are where God continues to show up. God shows up in bushes, in stables, in gardens, in jail cells, in homes, in boats, on the side of the road, on the side of a hill, scooted up to a dinner table. God shows up in ordinary places and says, are you ready? Are you ready? Moses had been doing this job in the wilderness for 40 years. How many times do you think he had walked past that bush before? That's an interesting question. He knew this area like the back of his hand. How many times do you think, just in 40 years, how many times do you think he'd been by that? But this time, in a really ordinary place, something extraordinary happens. And God calls him by name. So here's another question for us. How many times have you and I walked past something that seemed ordinary, but God was using it to try to get our attention? How many times? I'm talking about you. I'm talking about me. How many times did we walk by something that was normally a little bit different than the way we saw it? How many times did that happen and we didn't even notice? We walked past that place before. We've ignored these moments 1,000 times. But God is trying to say to each of us, in a real subtle, modest way, hey, can I get your attention? Maybe it's because of a real difficult conversation you need to have. Maybe it's a struggle at home. Maybe it's in a relationship. Maybe it's a challenge at work. But God is saying to us, hey, come here. I want to talk to you. The question is, will we pay attention? I promise if God is speaking to you, if you have a hunger or a desire to hear what he has to say, and you pay attention to it, God will speak to you. I don't necessarily mean it's going to come through the butane bush. I don't necessarily think it's going to be, something on the sky, something that's up above. There's not going to be anything that happens magically, but Moses opened himself up to what was happening. And I think God is trying to speak to a lot of us in here about what's happening around our lives. So he hears these words that I think tie into everything that we've been talking about last week and this week. Exodus chapter 3, verse 6. Then he said, this is what God said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, by this point, I don't think Moses is worrying about his sandals anymore. Okay? I think Moses is face down on the ground. He did what God told him to do, but I don't think he's standing anymore. I think he's having a conversation with God, and God begins to speak to him. God tells him that he's seen the atrocities in Egypt. He's seen the violence. He's seen the racial hatred. And then in chapter 3, verse 8, here's God's conclusion. I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. That sounds great, doesn't it? I'm sure Moses is going, wow, God, this is exactly what got me in trouble 40 years ago. Way to go. You go get him, God. Go get him. Have you ever told God to do that? I have. Just go bother him, God. Go torture him, God. You would never pray that, would you? Or have we? Yeah. if you put the conversation together between verses 8 and 10, here's what God says. He says, I'm coming down to fix this. I'm coming down to rescue these people. I'm coming down to deal with Pharaoh. And look what it says in verse 10. This is still God talking to Moses. So now, go. I don't know that Moses heard much more after that. I am sending you to Pharaoh. Now, was Moses' response, God, that is exactly what I was expecting. That is a good plan. I love that. I'm ready. Let's go. Is that his response? Not at all. Moses reacts the way you and I would. I think he's surprised. I think he's scared to death. I think in some ways he's a little disappointed. Like, whoa, wait a minute, God, didn't you just say you were going to go? What is this me go business? Don't like that. I think Moses knew exactly what was happening here. I think he knew that he had a responsibility. He knows about Egypt. He knows that Egypt is the most powerful empire in the world at that time. They have resources and armies and chariots and money. And Pharaoh was considered a god among his own people. And now Moses is supposed to face him. What have you been doing for the last 40 years? Tending sheep? Yeah. Once he realizes what God intends to do, Moses starts right in with the excuses. God, what if I can't say it right? What if I don't know what to say? What if they don't believe me? As you get through the story, some people have suggested that Moses was a stutterer. And that was why he didn't want to speak. That's why he wanted his brother Aaron to speak. And that may play into this. But God, he's basically asking, God, I don't understand how this is going to work. And in many ways, I think this whole conversation can be summed up by his first response. This is the first thing that falls out of his mouth in verse 11. He says in verse 11, who am I? Can I paraphrase that for you? God, you're great. But me, I'm a nobody. All I've got is this beard and some sheep and a slight resemblance to Charlton Heston. I'm a nobody, God. You guys don't ever let your imaginations go into this? Okay. Have you ever tried that one on God, by the way? When God calls you into a difficult situation, or he's saying, I want you to make a difference, I want you to serve, I'd really like for you to step into this situation, I want you to get involved. Do you just ever say to him, who am I? God, I'm a nobody. Or God, I'm too young. God, I'm too old. God, I'm just too whatever. I like the way Ken Davis explains this. He says, anytime we try this excuse, anytime we try to come to God and say, but God, I'm a nobody, God's response is always the same. I know. He knows that we are nobodies. Here's your next question. Do you think God is surprised by our shortcomings? No, I don't think so either. Do you think God doesn't already know? God is not looking for super spiritual, over-the-top, extraordinary people with spotless pasts and glistening resumes and great hair and perfect teeth. Right? That's not what God is looking for. And I would say this is our next slide. God is looking for ordinary people who will trust an extraordinary God. He's looking for ordinary people. By the way, that's me and you. Okay? Ordinary people. Now, if you need to turn to your spouse right now and say, ordinary but not like you, you're different. Okay? If you want to just really let them know that they're different. But God is looking for people who will trust him. He's looking for people who will walk into something together with him. The problem with Moses is where he was focusing on instead of who he was focusing on. And that's always the problem, isn't it? It's called perspective. We get into these things, and before you know it, we're looking in the wrong direction. Now, I have been told that this is a true story that I'm about to share with you. It's a little bizarre, but it's true. A young family was out camping. They get up one morning and decide to go for a hike. It's a beautiful day. They start to see these signs, real subtle, small signs. but signs that start to warn them that they are approaching a naturist camp. They think, hey, that's great. We love nature. That's why we're camping. So they're hiking along, and sure enough, a group of naturists are cycling up the path towards them. And for those of you who haven't caught on yet, a naturist is someone who loves nature so much that they cannot be encumbered by something as unnatural as clothing. Okay? Yeah. Oh, wow. That's a good response. So, these people recreate in the all together. That's who naturists are. So this young family is now walking up the path together. Meanwhile, there's a group of naturists bicycling towards them. And I'm sorry for the image that's in your mind right now, but they are cycling towards this family. The family is all standing at this point along the side of the road, and they are shocked. There's nothing they can do. It's too late, okay? So they just stand there, and they're all watching the parade go by. No one is saying a word except for the littlest one, who is tugging on Dad's sleeve, something fierce. And he's going, Dad, 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 did you see that? They weren't wearing any helmets. You'll tell that later this week. I know you will. I know, a silly story. But where you look makes all the difference. What we pay attention to makes all the difference. If we want words like hope and faith and trust and grace to be a part of our story, then it really comes down to what we're paying attention to. When Moses said, "Who am I?" God does not back up and go, "Oh, don't worry, Moses. I'm going to make you so impressive. I'm going to give you all the answers. I'm going to give you all the resources so much that people won't know what to do with you." That's not what he says. God's response in chapter 3, verse 12 is, "I'll be with you. I'll be with you." What he's saying is, listen, Moses, it's not about you. It's about me. I'll be there. I got it covered. Trust me. I'll be with you. But Lord, what do I say? Who do I tell them sent me? Look at verse 13. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'What is his name?' What shall I tell them?" Now let's be really clear. We already know that this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's already been laid out. This is not some new God to Israel. Moses is not trying to introduce some kind of new theology. But many think this is what's going on in Moses' head right now, is he's going, "God, I don't know your name. They're going to want to know a name. What do I call you? What am I supposed to tell them? Who are you going to be for these people? Who do I say sent me?" And God's answer is in verse 14. "I am who I am," which really cleared things up, right? Probably not. But this is a very difficult part of Scripture, but it's right here where God says categorically, "This is the name by which I will be known. This is my name forever. This is what you are to call me." Now, it's a mind-blowing moment for Moses. Because what God is saying is, I am the God who always was and always is and always will be. I am faithful and dependable and true. I am the one who always has been. I'm going to see you through this challenge, Moses. I am. And how interesting that centuries later, God through his Son would say, "I am the way and the truth and the life. I am the bread that will satisfy your hunger. I am the light that pushes back your darkness. I am the life that you so desperately want." This is pretty heavy stuff. And what God is saying is, I am and I always will be, no matter what you're going through, no matter what happens to you, I am. And what we see is God picks Moses, this washed up, insecure, out of circulation shepherd. And he says to him, "I am sending you. I am going to be with you. I am going to see you through this. I am." And we need to remember this, because if God is calling us to difficult conversations, if God is calling us to something new, if God is calling us to some opportunity that we don't think we're capable of, if God is calling us to give a particular relationship one more try, we do not have to face that alone. God will be there. I am going to be with you. I am. That's what God is calling us to. Now, from my vantage point, I am absolutely convinced, because of things that have happened here and things that are going to happen, that God is calling some of us to action, to take the next step. It might be for some of us in this room that we need to get involved. It might be to serve. It might be to start a conversation with somebody that you know needs to have that conversation. It might be to ask the hard question that's keeping you from getting involved and just getting into what God is calling you to do. It might be to ask the question, God, will you forgive me? If God is calling you to something and you're feeling inadequate for the task, if you're feeling broken, if you're feeling like you're too far gone, if you feel like a loser, which is what Moses felt like, if you feel like you have nothing to do, nothing that can be of any consequence, with all due respect, you are absolutely wrong. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knows us by name. He's calling us into a different world. He's calling us into an experience with him, and he will meet us there. What I know from what I see here and what I've experienced in my life, he will clean us up. He will forgive us and restore us. He will show us things the likes of which we've never seen before. It's going to take way longer than we want it to, but God is faithful, and God is saying to some of us this morning, I am enough. We live in a world where God is trying to get our attention. You and I walk by burning bushes every day. Little moments where God is saying to us, come here, pay attention. But we're just not very good at it. So, 2 action steps, and then we'll be done. Very simple. First, take a step. Just take a step. If there's something God is calling you to do, just take a step in that direction. That's the first thing. Take a step. Second, number 2, pay attention. Let's pay attention this week. I want us to pay attention for God this week. The God who loves us. The God who knows us by name. The God who sent his own son to rescue us. The God who allowed his son to die on a cross in our place. You see, one of the things that you need to understand about me is I think God is here. I think he's in this room. I think he's in this place. I think he's trying to say something to us. So the greatest words that I could give you would be these. We really should listen. We really should. Would you bow with me in prayer, please? Father in heaven, what an experience for Moses. I try with my imagination, God, to picture what this would have been like. I'm thankful that you chose him and used him in an incredible way to save your people. Can't wait to learn more about it next week. Father, bring us all back so that we can pick up on other pieces of what you want us to do, of the puzzle that you've placed in front of us to put together. And Father, I thank you for your word, that it continues to show us that you're going to see me through this. You're going to see us through whatever comes. And I ask that you lead us now. In the name of Jesus, we pray this. Amen. Would you please stand for my favorite song?